Another minute or so, we'll get going. Okay. Yeah, right now we've muted everybody else's mic. We'll take care of that a little bit later on as we get going. So everybody's muted right now. We'll control that and we'll deal with questions in a minute. So let's get started. We good to go, Steph? All right, thumbs up from Steph. That's always good. Hey, welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name is Michael Hine. I'm the CEO of the Tri-States Chamber of Commerce, and we're really happy to have everybody here today. We've done about 20 of these so far on different topics. We've got more coming up. I think you're going to find a good one next week. We're just finalized one for next week to talk about the wage subsidy program, and tentatively scheduled for next Tuesday with MMP, good friends of ours, talking about that, which will be very timely. But thanks for everybody coming out. The Chamber's been doing a lot of work in the last 5 weeks or a month on keeping everybody informed of what's going on during this unusual and unprecedented times. So if you're not signed up on our email, get our weekly or daily emails, please do so. We get information out very quickly as it's announced, in a timely manner, in a very efficient manner too. So there's not too much. We get to the point and give you links to where you got to go to get stuff. Fill out the mind reader surveys you get that come out too. I was just on a call with my other BC Chamber representatives from throughout the province, and I can tell you the mind reader survey stuff that comes out every 2 weeks goes straight to the Premier's office. So please fill that out. They need to hear what you're seeing and hearing out there. So please make sure you fill out the surveys. I know you think it's another survey, but it's very important because I guarantee you it goes right to the Premier and the Finance Minister's office, because the BC Chamber sits on the committee that's helping them steer them through this. We have our Support Local program. We have over 350 plus businesses on our website that are open for business, so please check them out. It's growing every day. If your business isn't on there and you're open for business in a modified format that's keeping up with health regs, please do so. And we're here for you. We got this. I think we got this, Tri-Cities. I know we got this. Check out our Twitter feed. Check out the Support Local. We just posted a video with Jay Janauer about an hour ago. It's really cool. Jay did a great job supporting local business and talking about how important it is to support local. Look for more stuff coming up pretty quickly. Enough about me, enough about what's going on right now. We're here to help you, but right now we want to talk about our topic of the day, commercial leases in a time of COVID-19. Very timely topic. We know May 1st is coming up, and that's a big date for everybody with leases. The government, it is top of the mind with both levels of government. I can tell you that because I was just on the BC Chamber call, and I know they've made it, the Premier and the Finance Minister know, and I've been on calls every morning with the federal government, and it comes up all the time there. And I was told this morning by a Deputy Minister of Small Business that they are aware of it. They are working diligently on it. They know the time is time sensitive. So I think Daniel might touch on it a little bit more later. But I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker and our presenter today. He's Daniel Richardson. He's the managing partner of BTM Lawyers. He's a trial lawyer with experience in civil litigation and in construction and real estate disputes. He acts for commercial tenants and landlords from lease negotiations to dispute resolution. So he's well-rounded in all these forms. Before Daniel joined BTM Lawyers in 2010, he was a general counsel at one of BC's largest real estate developers. So he knows the real estate game from both ends, and we're lucky to have him. BTM is a great partner of the chamber and a great community sponsor, and great to have them here today. So I'm going to turn over without any further ado, Daniel Richardson.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks everyone for joining today. I won't spend too much time in introduction, but just wanted to let everyone know that, in terms of questions that you might have after this, what I'm looking for is more general questions. If you have really specific questions that need specific lease review or specific to your circumstances involving confidential privilege information, what I'm offering is do a free clinic. I'm looking tentatively scheduling it for Thursday between 2 and 5 o'clock, and anyone who wants to call my reception and book a half-hour free consult, you'll be asked for all the parties on the lease, and then some conflict searches can be done, and we could get into a little bit more specific information for your particular circumstance. And that's sort of a free half hour, and we can cover sort of a limited amount of stuff in that time, but I can sort of deal more specifically with your particular issue. Today is more just an overview of some things that may be important to consider in the current situation, and just to give everyone a bit more knowledge and understanding of what happens when particularly rent doesn't get paid. So just to move on here, these are the topics we're going to cover. Read your lease, know the names, the term of the lease, some hot clause that's been, you'll probably hear of as force majeure, and then frustration of contract. Go over to pay or not to pay your rent, what the risks are, possible outcomes and considerations, options to be reached by agreement, some other considerations, and then sort of a conclusion. As I don't have too much time, I'll get right into it. The reason why I think it's important to know the names on your lease, is the tenant a corporation or a person? And do you have any personal indemnifiers or corporate indemnifiers? And those are really important in considering the extent of liability that a tenant may have, or on the landlord's side, the likelihood of success of recovering anything if you're going to sue your tenant. Largely, corporations are often set up to have a limitation on liability, but in many commercial tenancies, there's a requirement that the landlord has when you signed up that you may have personally indemnified, or the owners of the company may have personally indemnified the lease. So what that means, if you've indemnified it and the tenant itself does not follow through, you're personally on the hook and liable for the damages that may be resulting. So I mentioned that it's important to read your lease, know who the parties are, because they may be very important in your assessment of risk. The term of the lease, and know how long the term of your lease is. Again, this is pretty important for considering the extent of your liability. The longer the term, the greater the liability risk. Essentially, in theory, you could be, as a tenant, liable up to the extent of the term. So if you've got a couple months left on your lease, the decision may be an easier one than if you have, 5 or 10 years left on your lease, and what that might mean sort of in the overall number. Another thing that's important for term is, if rights of renewal, options to purchase, other future rights that might be built into your tenant, your lease, something that you want to consider, because that's sort of an outside long-term right that you may have in the future, that if the lease is breached by non-payment of rent or something like that, your ability to take advantage of those long-term rights could be impacted negatively. So for the purpose of a short-term issue. So if your intention is to have the space for a long time, and maybe you've got an option to purchase you'd like to exercise, or there's renewal rights and you want to have those in place, but you think you might not be able to pay rent for 2 months, think about the short-term issues with that, and the effect on the long-term rights you may have. So with respect to the force majeure, what is force majeure? Typically it's a clause that you'll find in a lease. It's not in all leases, but it's in many commercial leases, if not most, that are more sophisticated or properly prepared. The clause excuses the performance of a contractual obligation during events where such performance is impossible due to circumstances beyond their control. So that's generally what the clause captures. They're all slightly different. Some may be broader, some may be more specific. So that's why it's important to read your lease and know what your force majeure clause says. And the next question is the COVID-19 pandemic an event that triggers a force majeure clause? And the classic legal answer is maybe, and it depends. It depends on the particular wording of the clause, of course. But I think if you're looking at it from particular circumstances, we've got you'll have a good argument if a government's prohibiting or restricting your business from opening at all. It's very, you're not allowed by government order to operate. That's, in many circumstances, I see that probably would fit within many more force majeure clauses. However, that's not the case for everyone. And, as an example of another business that may be significantly affected to the point of having to close doors, it may not apply. For instance, many businesses can operate at some capacity, and it's just not economically viable for them to do so. So they've shut their doors. And in that case, it may not be something that a tenant can rely on. In fact, I'd say the force majeure clause is probably clearer in circumstances for the landlord where, for instance, a mall was ordered to be shut and no public access. They can't provide access to the space by government order, and that would allow them to say, look, force majeure applies here, and sorry, we can't give you the space that you rented. Whereas it may be less less enforceable, or an event where a restaurant or a retail store who can operate in some limited capacity, for instance, restaurants with takeouts or deliveries or online sales where they can use their space to some extent. It's not a complete impossibility outside of their control. So what happens if a force majeure clause is applicable? Again, you have to read the wording of the lease itself and the clause, but in most instances, it would suspend the obligation. So the landlord does not need to give the space, and in turn, the rent does not need to be paid. It doesn't end the lease. So in most circumstances, typically it just sort of preserves the rights of both parties under the lease and suspends it. So, I've heard a lot of anecdotal or chat with people, oh, force majeure, I can terminate my lease. And I'd say that's probably not the case with your specific circumstance. But of course, you'd have to take a look at your lease. So that's the force majeure clause that you may have heard some back and forth about, or what a lot of tenants are looking to scramble and see if they have in their lease and can rely on. Frustration of a lease. So frustration is a legal principle. It's not something that you'd find within your lease. So generally, frustration of a contract, and a lease is a contract, would apply when there is no force majeure clause found within your contract to deal with issues that we find ourselves. And so what the doctrine requires is that for frustration to be found, you need an unexpected event to occur that is beyond the reasonable control of the parties, and that it makes performance of the contract impossible or materially different from what was initially contemplated. So again, on the same line is the COVID pandemic an event that triggers frustration, and similar to force majeure, it may be, and it depends on each individual businesses or tenants or landlord circumstances. And the court ultimately would decide it on a case-by-case basis. Again, a government order to stop operating to fulfill, may fulfill the test of frustration rather than a reduction in business due to the financial crisis and the stay-at-home order directive that creates financial problems and not viable to stay open. that's not really something, the fact that you're not doing well financially isn't something that would trigger, in my sort of review, frustration of contract. So, if there is frustration of your contract, is applicable, what happens? And in this case, the lease is actually terminated. And so there's no further obligations going forward. And, that's quite a bit different than the force majeure. And that's why I think you'll see most leases have a force majeure clause in it. And they're, most tenants won't have this termination right that would be brought on by a frustration of contract. Again, your specific circumstances would have to be looked at, of course. Now, one of the questions that most tenants and landlords are facing is, to pay or not to pay rent, or whether your tenants are going to pay or not pay rent. So non-payment of rent, of course, is a breach of lease unless there's a force majeure or frustration of contract apply. And if you're going to be relying on those sort of relief options, you certainly want to get some legal advice on it and provide written notice. Just not paying rent and then using sort of some terms later to excuse it is probably not a wise decision. So, what happens if you don't pay rent? Well, most likely you're in default. Payment of rent is almost always a material term of a lease. And there may be something in the lease that provides some notice period upon which you can remedy your default, but ultimately there's likely a termination of the lease that will be available to the landlord. The tenant may lose the premises, may be locked out by the landlord, and the contents of the premises may be seized and sold to make up for some of the damages. Ultimately, the tenant could be liable for up to the balance of the term of the lease. And also, as we noted before, that issue with, what names are on the lease, both the tenant's name or the indemnifier's name, whether there's personal or corporate assets there. Pardon me. Sorry. I did not have my phone on Do Not Disturb. Sorry, I just did that now. Possible outcomes or considerations. Well, from the landlord's perspective, many landlords these days we're finding, and some not so willing to cooperate, but most are willing to cooperate with their tenants. From the landlord's perspective, they probably don't want an empty space and a lawsuit against a potentially bankrupt tenant, rather than giving rent relief solutions to their tenants to maintain the tenancy. However, landlords may take the opportunity to push the tenant out if they're in breach because perhaps they don't like the tenant, perhaps there's a very tenant-friendly lease. Again, there's options or renewals in there that the landlord doesn't, gave away some time ago and wants to take back. So there's always sort of that trade-off is, there's the power imbalance as to who's got something the other wants. And if there's some value in the lease to the landlord, they may want to terminate it. In terms of terminating it, if there's value in keeping it, they'll probably work with you to keep it. Also the landlord, as I said, can use the force majeure clause to keep the lease alive and avoid, frustration or termination or whatnot. If they can't if they can't give the tenant the space, there's an ability to maintain the terms of the lease. And in terms of the outcomes and considerations of not paying rent for the tenant, again, tenants will lose the space, owe the landlord the balance of the term. In an up market where commercial real estate is in demand, breaching your lease and require the landlord having to go out and release it and mitigate their damage may not be as great a risk because there's lots of potential tenants, and the balance of the term, say it's 5 years left and they sign a new 6-year term with a new tenant for more than you were actually renting it, that's something that you're probably not going to be liable for much. But right now, with all the uncertainty as to how valuable commercial real estate is going to be and what the actual rents are going to be, if you're out of your space and you got 5 years term left and the landlord turns around and the fair market rent is half of what it was, you could be liable for that, the half balance of the term. So again, it's that duration and the uncertainty in what could be potentially a bad real estate market from a commercial perspective could impact your liability. So I'm just checking the time here. Yeah, so one thing that tenants should obviously really consider is working with their landlord for shorter long-term solutions. What will the tenant lose if you're liable? So you're going to want to consider the assets of your company, what your assets personally. In some circumstances, whether it be personal or corporate bankruptcy is not a bad decision. Obviously, something you'd want to do with good advice, but obviously, looking what you have to lose is always an important consideration when you're figuring out what to do next. So the other thing I guess tenants are facing right now is business is going to fail. Is there any point in reopening the doors? Is continuation not an option? And so those are things that may be very real and may be a consideration in deciding whether you're going to pay rent or not. So the best case is typically to come to an agreement between your landlord or your tenant. I certainly recommend all the agreements be documented and reviewed by a lawyer. But a couple options for agreements that you might reach: agreements to abate or defer all or portion of your rent. Abatement is really where no rent is going to be owing for a period of time, whereas a deferral is the rent is paid at a later date. I'm seeing in many cases these days where rent may be deferred for a number of months and then spread over the balance of the term or the balance of a period of time, whereas abatement would be just it's not owed to be paid back at a later date. You may also need to contemplate with between the landlord and tenant whether there's an option to amend the lease, maybe adjust the term of the lease, adjust the value of the rent, size of the premises. These are all options that you may want to discuss between the parties as a workable solution. Ultimately, I guess there's sublease and assignments of lease for part or all of your premises. So if you have someone that can take the space, again, that's still to be seen how much demand there is for commercial space in the coming months and years. Of course, if there's a requirement to terminate the lease, it's typically better to come to some form of agreement on the terms of the termination, and then you document the termination of the lease. Normally a termination of lease would require some level of penalty, but you can at least crystallize your damages as opposed to wondering what you might have to pay and be personally liable for. Again, of course, any agreement reached between the landlord and tenant should be properly documented with the advice of an experienced lawyer in commercial real estate. A couple other considerations I wanted to put up here that are important to think about, and this is not an exhaustive list, and your particular circumstances may not be covered by anything I'm talking about, but there's business rental interruption insurance that many tenants and landlords have coverage for. I think that a lot of those policies may have exclusions for pandemics and certain things, but still it's worthwhile to have a look at your policy, have a chat with your insurance broker and see whether there's some options there for you. Government relief options, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think the one that's most relevant to our current topic is the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program, which was sort of discussed on Thursday and in terms of the release that there's going to be something coming. My source, which I don't know how reliable this information is just one option that's been sort of trickling down, is it looks like there's going to be some level of rent reduction based on the percentage of reduced revenue. So for instance, 50% drop in revenue tenant would pay 50% of the rent, and the government subsidy would go to the landlord for the reduced rent received. This is just very, I don't know at all if there's any accuracy to this. It's contrary to what I was reading over the weekend, but this is sort of the most recent rumor that I've heard as to what the relief might be, and that they are motivated to do it quickly because May 1 is coming, and they know that this is a big problem for many businesses, particularly businesses where rent is one of their bigger costs as opposed to wages, because wages have been addressed. So then, of course, there's the Canadian or Canada Emergency Business Account, the 40% interest-free loan with the 10% forgiveness if it's repaid within a certain amount of time. The two wage subsidies, the 10% and the 75%. And then I guess the other government payment deferral programs and loan programs that have been rolling out over the last month and a half. So really, in conclusion, takeaways I want you to take from here is read your lease and know your rights and risks. It's really important to get legal advice before making some pretty important decisions. Again, I'm offering 30 minutes free consult on lease top lease issues for people who want that. I'm going to be booking it from 2 to 5 on this Thursday. So just please feel free to call my reception and book that time. Again, I'm going to want to know the parties involved so that I can do a proper conflict search and make sure I can give the advice appropriately. The law is not one size fits all, and not all leases are the same. So, what I've said today may not necessarily be true in your particular circumstances. Do not make hasty, knee-jerk decisions that jeopardize the financial future of your business, your investment, or you personally. And obviously access all government relief available. And the best scenario is to work either with your landlord or your tenant through the crisis and get through it so that you continue your long-term relationship. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. And there's your contact information there. Please get that down. We can send that out to you too. Right, Steph? We'll get that out to everybody. So please feel free to contact BTM Lawyers and Daniel, the managing partner over there, if you got any more questions. But we're taking your questions right now. So please put them in the chat below, type them in there, click the chat button, type your questions in. If you're on Facebook, type your questions there. I've got a couple coming in here. So I'll start with the first one. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this one, but Daniel goes, if you want to terminate your lease because of COVID-19, should you go directly to the landlord or work through a commercial agent?
That's a good question. I would say, it depends on your relationship with your landlord. If it's always good to have an agent negotiating terms for you, whether it be your commercial real estate agent or a lawyer. It depends on your level of sophistication as well in your relationship. But I would always recommend using either agents or lawyers for any, significant negotiations in these types of things.
Thought for sure you're going to say lawyer. Just saying. Next question is, if a landlord is receiving a reduction to property taxes, such as the reduction in the school levy, which we've seen gone down significantly, is there a requirement to pass these along to the tenants?
Well, mostly, yeah, those extra additional rent costs, operating costs will be passed on. I just don't know if they'll be passed on immediately. Right? Typically, they set the expected additional rent for the year, you pay it, and then there's a reconciliation at the end of the year. So there may be an ability within your lease to sort of challenge that process. Certainly for the landlords, if they want to keep their tenants, there's going to be some motivation for them to try and reduce it if there's a clear reduction right off the bat. But I don't know if the immediate reduction they'd have to do their internal accounting and come up with their adjusted operating costs and then pass that down, which is usually done at the end of the year.
Yeah, that was the next part, provided this year or in the year that the landlord does their year-end reconciliation of expenses. So that was the next part. You kind of answered that. Another question coming in. Keep the questions coming, folks. That's great. Although the rent relief program is not out yet, do you think businesses will be able to access this program if they've already taken out the Canadian Emergency Benefit or Business Assistance?
I mean, I don't know what the government's going to do, so I can't really comment on what I expect. I mean, my feeling is that the government's trying to put as much money out there as possible to keep things flowing as easily as possible. And I don't anticipate a lot of, crossover. But I mean, I don't know. I know as little as the next person in terms of how the government's going to react next.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure on that one, but if I'm guessing, I'd guess that they're probably going to be separate, but don't know.
I mean, they're different issues, right?
Yeah,
like there's
exactly.
businesses that have high payroll and those are the large monthly expenses that are causing the major financial crisis. Others that may have a low payroll and rent is the big one. And then of course there's many businesses who find themselves that are in a cash crunch for both wages and commercial rent and any other fixed costs or costs they may have. So I would be surprised if they say you can't get one or the other.
Okay, and this one, if a lease was being renewed when the public health orders were imposed, but only the subject removal doc was signed, are the leases legally bound to, is the leasee legally bound to the lease, notwithstanding that it has not been signed? Interesting.
So I mean, if
a lease was being renewed when the public health orders were imposed, but only the subject removal document was signed, are the leasees legally bound to the lease? The lease itself.
Well, they remove conditions on a subject. Likely they're bound by it. I'd have to take a look at the actual lease renewal document and whether it was completed. I mean, really, it's just an extension of the contract. You have to meeting of the minds and confirmation of all the parties that you're moving forward. So, I mean, if there's something that wasn't complete or agreed to, ultimately that might give you an out. Again, that's probably something that we'd have to look at a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, I would think that'd be one you want to consult a lawyer on, because that could get a little interesting.
Yeah. It's a good issue.
Yeah, legal minds would like that one. So another concern from Anita Wilson here. Thanks for tuning in, Anita, again. We're working hard for you. I'm still concerned that everything seems to be putting the landlord completely in the driver's seat, with the onus on the tenant to solve this. Without a force majeure clause, it seems the option to pay is to pay or terminate and take the hit. If you're simply unable to pay due to government, regulatory, college order, even if you use the frustration clause, this still terminates the lease and the tenant risks losing everything invested in their business. Care to comment on, am I understanding this correctly?
Well, just to be clear, the frustration of contract is not a clause, a written clause within your contract. It's a legal concept that, what everyone bargained for isn't possible anymore. And it's probably a bit rare. It's a little, I think most people will have terms in their lease that will contemplate shutdowns, interruption, that sort of thing that we're dealing with. And force majeure is typically, the clause that would deal with this unforeseen event that we're dealing with right now. And yeah, I mean, the lease on the black letter of it is pretty black. It's black or white in many cases. You pay rent or you don't pay rent. And there's termination rights if you don't pay rent, and there's no clauses that apply. But on the practical side of things, again, the landlords potentially see there's a lot of risk in losing tenants. So there's a market value in keeping those tenants and making them happy. And so there's the legal side of things, and then there's of course the business side of things for all parties. And I think given that we're all trying to get through this, I'd like to think there is some opportunities to work between landlords and tenants, regardless of the rights. Much of the time it's who holds the power is, what's the more valuable thing, the lease, the term, the tenant, and that often skews the bargaining power of the parties.
Okay, keep those questions coming. I got one from Facebook here. I've heard some small businesses with sole proprietorship saying they may have to walk away if no income comes their way. how does this work? What are the legal ramifications of walking away from your lease?
Well, as I discussed before, it depends on the extent of the term of your lease, whether you have personally signed the lease in your own name, or whether you've got it in the name of, or you've indemnified the lease. You're potentially liable for the balance of the term. So if you've got, if you're paying $50,000 a year for your space, and you've got 4 more years, you could be liable up to 200,000. And if your company goes bankrupt because it has no assets, but you personally indemnified it, then you're personally liable for that as well. So now there's a duty to mitigate, fill the space, reduce your damages on the landlord. But again, in an uncertain time of how the market's going to react and whether that space will be desirable for someone to come along and release, there's more, I'd say there's more risk at a time like this than perhaps when it's the normal course, and in a place like specifically the Tri-Cities where, industrial and retail space is, at a pretty good premium and pretty desirable. That may not be the case going forward.
Okay. Is there any recourse for a situation where the landlord doesn't even respond to a request for discussion on the matter?
I mean, that's interesting. I guess it's landlords who are not responsive are basically telling you pay rent, and you can make a choice at that point as to what you want to do. Now, again, the reason why I think it's wise to be cautious at this point is because there is relief coming in some capacity. We saw with the wage subsidies, a lot of people went, and a lot of businesses terminated many employees, and then had to rehire them back. And so again, the knee-jerk reaction, I mean, government's reacting rather than getting in front of this, but I think in some circumstances, limiting your liability and waiting to see what happens, might be the better option. But yeah, I mean, if the landlord doesn't respond, the way you'll get them to wake up is not paying rent, and then they'll find out how they want to deal with you, and that could be risky though for you. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, and I know government. I mean, sometimes, as I've said this before in these webinars, the politicians will make announcements, and it's up to the civil servants behind the scene to kind of figure it out how it's done. I.e., the wage subsidy announced it a couple weeks ago, or within the last 10 days, and they still trying to figure out how to do it behind the scenes as civil servants. So sometimes they make the announcements, there's a lag time, and I suspect with the rent subsidy, it'll probably be the same thing. They'll announce it, and it'll take a while for it to get through set up the systems behind the scenes to make it work. They do it with the best of intentions, but we're talking billions and billions of dollars in transactions. To move that in what normally takes a year or two in a week or two is a monumental task. So just stay tuned on that one. Another one's come in here. If a tenant has a landlord locked in multiple years in a recently signed lease extension, non-indemnified company name, then wouldn't they be more motivated to sue for damages rather than renegotiate the lease? So
I mean, yeah, like there can be. I mean, I know from experience as a lawyer, many people try and avoid getting me involved in litigation. So, there's usually an opportunity for resolution in any dispute. Obviously, the values do matter. So, the greater the value to one party, the more motivated they are to take that valuable side. So, if they think that someone who has lots of money, personally indemnified, lots of assets in the company, and they think there's value in the lawsuit, I guess maybe they'd be motivated to terminate the lease. And that's why I say there's risk in not paying rent, because for the sake of 1 or 2 months or 3 months, do you want to open yourself up to that potential liability?
Okay. Any other questions, folks? We're just coming up to the end of time here. Anything else out there? Start typing if you got them. Any last Closing words. I know, okay, so further to that last one from Blake. I know it varies, but what are the typical legal costs with challenging a landlord? I don't know if you want to go there or want to.
Well, I mean, most of this is done on an hourly basis, depends on the various lawyers, but I mean, anything that goes to arbitration is at least tens of thousands of dollars in my experience.
Okay.
But often resolutions can be reached for much less than that. Not everything has to go to arbitration or court.
And Parm's asking, do you see renewal rates going down in the near future? Renewal rates.
Probably better for commercial realtors would probably be better answer to that. I'm not really that apprised. I just look back to the last financial crisis. What happened? Not so much in BC per se, but the risk is that if it's as bad as say, some of the places that were hit hard in the U.S. in the last financial crisis, you had massive amounts of commercial real estate standing empty for years and years and years. I don't personally think that's going to happen here, but I mean, those how the market's going to go, I don't think even the best realtors are going to be able to anticipate at this point. But they're also better equipped to answer that question than me.
I agree. I guess the only variable I would say is that a lot of people are finding ways to work out of their home, and that may become more the norm. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the future after this.
Yeah, I mean, we're all desperate to get back with other people too. So
some are. Any other questions? Oh, okay, here we go. I'm a new business open in January 2020. I have not qualified for a business loan as I do not have pay for the business loan, and they're not payroll for 2019. Do you think the commercial rent assistance program will be available for new businesses just opening in 2020? Good question.
I sure hope so. I mean, they did do that, some level of subsidy, like the options for the wage subsidy. You could look at your average of January, February versus the year before. I mean, I think that they would apply similar principles to this, but in terms of your revenue calculations.
Okay. The landlord has asked me to pay for rent, asked me to pay rent by applying for the business assistance, SEBA. But this is a sole proprietorship with no employees.
Sorry, well, perhaps what they're referring to is the ability to access financing. There's the interest-free loan available. I guess that there is a minimum of, I believe it was 20,000 payroll or something.
It's 20,000 minimum. Now they've lowered the floor to 20, but you have to have the salary. You have to issue T4s if you're taking dividends or taking a draw.
And I mean, I have heard from some accountants that you may be able to, and again, I'm not an accountant, but there have been some accountants who have suggested if you don't typically do your own, T4 payroll, maybe you can adjust the way you paid yourself this year. But I'm not the accountant to know whether that's actually possible to qualify for the loans.
Yeah, no, that's an issue. We've identified that you have to have a T4 payroll to qualify for the loans currently. We brought that up with the minister. We brought it up at all levels. It was brought up this morning on my call with the federal government. They're aware of it. They're aware of it from across the country. It's not just a BC issue. It's coming from places like Kitchener-Waterloo, a tech sector where they got lots of sole proprietors and entrepreneurs like that. So the government's aware of it. We're pressuring them, and we will keep doing that. We will keep working on that on everybody's behalf. I think we're wrapping up now. I think we're about done. So once again, thank you, Daniel from BTM Lawyers. They're in Suterbrook in Port Moody, and you see the numbers there. If you want to call Daniel and his team down there and take advantage of a free consultation for 30 minutes on Thursday, that's great. And he's very open to talking to you all the time anyways. He's in the community. He's part of the community. His firms, most of them live in the community. So please go see them if you got any questions. For upcoming events for the chamber, we could probably have a webinar on Tuesday, it sounds like, with MMP to talk about the wage subsidy and how that's working. I know you can start applying on the 27th, which is Monday. We decided to do the webinar on Tuesday just to see what bugs are in there, what questions come up. So we're sending that information out tomorrow. So we're going to do that Tuesday morning. Still give you lots of time to apply for the wage subsidy, but let's let the bugs work out for a day. So that's with MMP on Tuesday. And we got lots of other stuff coming up. Please check out the website. If you're a business that's open, still doing business, whatever form you're in, please get your name on the Support Local website. Support local businesses. Let us know how we can help you. We're working with all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. We're right there lobbying them to get this stuff done quicker and better and make sure people don't fall through the cracks. If you read the article in the Tri-City News today, you would see some of the things we're talking about. Stay safe out there, stay healthy, everybody, and please let us know how we can help you, and have a great day.
Thanks.